Nazis Week, with talks in Paris hosted by President Emmanuel Macron. Mr. Scholz will then head to Brussels to meet EU and NATO leaders. They're expected to discuss a growing list of European foreign policy challenges, including the build-up of Russian forces on the border with Ukraine. The British government's announced plans to ban imports of hunting trophies from endangered animals. The proposed law would prevent hunters bringing... is marking the death of the head of its armed forces, General Bipin Rawat, who died in a helicopter crash on Wednesday. He'll be cremated with full military honours in the capital, Delhi. Political leaders have been paying tribute. Hundreds of people gathered outside his residence. General Rawat's wife and 11 armed forces personnel also died in the crash in the state of Tamil Nadu. There was one survivor. That's the latest world news from the BBC.
天天在一起，天天用心听，听见台北的声音。FM 93.1，幸福永远属于你。
公民总主笔，
方恩格时间。
谁当家？
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 你当家？
谁当家？
谁当家？
谁当家？我当家。你当家？我当家。到底谁当家？你来当家。
To Residence Messenger on Taipei Broadcasting Station. Our very special guest tonight is Captain Chris Carney, a sailboat captain based here in Taiwan and an expert on Taiwan's sailing and boating scene. Captain Chris, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks, man. Nice to be here.
Now, before we talk about sailing and other boating activities here in Taiwan, tell us a little bit about your background. Where do you come from?
I grew up in Houston, but my folks lived in Minnesota when I was a little kid, and my dad always had sailboats, and so I kind of grew up around the water.
Of course, Minnesota being known as the state with a lot of lakes, correct?
Right. Yeah, we were on Lake Superior mostly.
Well, was sailing an activity that you did a lot of as a child, or were you more interested in other outdoor activities?
Well, in the summer, every weekend we were always out on the boat, so that was kind of the main thing when I was a little kid.
And what kind of boats were you doing when you were a kid?
Smaller, like 30, 35, 40-foot sailboats, things like that.
Now, we'll talk a little bit later in the show about how people could get into sailing, but I'll ask you now, is this something that to really excel at this activity, you need to get into it when you're a child, like a lot of other sports that require, starting when you're really young, whether it's baseball or skating, for example?
Well, the things that I consider intuitive about sailing, a lot of people don't, so that might be a product of having started when I was young, but I don't think so. I think most guys start when they make enough money to buy their own boat. so I think that's, you can start whenever. It's pretty basic. You learn a few things and you kind of learn as you go.
Speaking of learning, where did you go to school?
I went to school in Texas.
And when you're in school, did you envision that someday you'd be sailing in Asia? Did you have Asia on your mind when you were a student or a university student?
When I was in university, all my friends were going to Europe and coming back with stories about the Eurail Pass and running with the bulls and things like that, and I didn't have much interest in that, and so I went and lived in Beijing for 6 months.
And what brought you to Taiwan the first time?
Well, I didn't like China very much, so
I guess you came to the right place.
A friend of mine in Beijing told me you should check out Taiwan. It's westernized and food's great, and I didn't really believe him, but I came here and I loved it from the first time, and so ever since then I've been back and forth.
Now, about how long have you been here in Taiwan?
20 plus years.
And what was it because of the opportunities to sail that you first came here? Was that a priority when you were considering where to relocate to?
No, that had nothing to do with it. it actually wasn't until about 10 years ago that the thing liberalized here enough that private citizens could own their own boats and legally moor in the marinas.
That's a good segue into helping us understand a bit to sail a boat in different places around the world, whether the United States, here in Taiwan. Do you need the equivalent of a driver's license? Keep in mind, a lot of us who are listening to the show, we're not familiar with the requirements to sail a boat. What does it take to be as far as formal qualifications or requirements to operate a sailboat?
Well, in America, it doesn't really require anything, just having a boat. But over here, to have your boat registered in Taiwan and legally be the captain, you're meant to have a permit to drive a small craft, and so you have to know the ins and outs of navigation and things like that. Not really anything about sailing a sailboat.
So you have to take a written test.
Yeah, there's a written test, and there's like the ASA 100 is a standard American Association of Sailing. It's a standard test that people take, and they get certified to pilot a boat.
Is the test available in English, or it's only in Chinese?
No, it's available in English. I think most of the certified captains that grant you your license are English speakers. And it's available in Taiwan. You can take the course. There's several different outlets where you can take it.
And when you actually went to finalize the paperwork, were they surprised to see a foreign applicant who wanted to have the required qualification here in Taiwan?
Oh, well, I already had all of that training from America, and it doesn't expire like a driver's license. You just keep it for life.
What about some of the physical challenges? Help us understand a bit about actually being on the boat. Who could really excel at this physically? Do people really need to have a certain height, certain weight at least? Strong upper body parts, lower body parts. Help us understand the physical challenges.
Well, it certainly is a younger man's sport, because there are some physical challenges with the weight of the sails and the ropes and running around on deck. So you have to be agile enough and can't get too tired. And it can be quite challenging. I mean, it depends on the size of the boat also, but I mean, even a small boat works more like a surfing platform. So the bigger boats, although they may be slightly automated, they still require a lot of physicality. So I would assume that fellas getting up in their 60s, they're already starting to bow out of the game.
Does this apply to everyone who's going to join on the sailboat? I mean, what I mean is the captain going to be more hands-on and really requires more of the physical skill? And some friends who are there more as a social activity could help out, but again, they could be a little older and maybe lend a hand, but they're really not the key people.
Well, yeah, I mean, so for the charters that I have, when we're leaving, we're just even on the harbor. On the way out, I like to offer who wants to drive, and then get somebody a little bit more nimble with that task. And so if something happens where I have to go up on deck, that at least someone has some experience in piloting a boat. But I mean, for all the things that I've ever done, it's people can be as involved and as uninvolved as they want. Mostly, I mean, like what I've done before is all like chartering, and people, some of them want to be hands-on, and some of them just want to hang and have snacks and watch the water go by and drink beer.
Speaking of the more enjoyable parts of what you do, in the past 10 years, as you've been doing more of this here in Taiwan, do you ever say to yourself, it's great here, but there's some more popular places in Asia, more scenic places? Did you ever think about moving on to another location to do sailing?
Well, I've done quite quite a bit of sailing in Japan and the Philippines. And those places have a lot more islands and a lot more coastline that is protected. Taiwan's ocean is not very protected. As soon as you leave port, you're basically right in the swell. So there are places that are probably better for it, but Taiwan has been my home, and so I never really would ever commit to having been anywhere else. I just like it here.
And when you talk to people you know, maybe in the industry, in the region or around the world, when you tell them what you just said about, you know, Taiwan is home and it has its advantages for sailing, what kind of reaction do you get? Are people surprised to hear that, you know, Taiwan has its advantages for sailing?
Oh, yeah, I'd say so, because most of the international sailing community, as a rule, avoids Taiwan because it's difficult to navigate all the government restrictions. Hard to even enter port for the first time, and so lots of people on their way north or south just completely bypass it.
Well, we'll get a little bit into some of that government challenges a little later in the show, but at least for people who are based here, and you mentioned the charters, why would people want to go out on a sailboat as a leisure activity here or around Taiwan? What are they going to experience, and why would they do that versus other leisure activities, for example?
Well, sailboats are totally green, right? When the engine's not running and the boat's just going completely under sail, and all you hear is the sound of the water and no engine, and when the boat's powered up and it just carves right through the water, it's an incredible feeling. And then you can, I mean, when we're out, everybody has their own input, and they say, all right, we want to stop and go for a swim, or we want to pull up to a reef and go for a dive, or do whatever you want. So basically, when the people charter the boat, they're in charge of what they want to do. And nice conditions, it's about the most pleasant thing that you could ever imagine.
And when are the best conditions for people who, especially for people who haven't done this before and were maybe thinking about chartering the boat? What are the best times of year to do that?
Summer. So right now we've got these northeasterlies, so the entire East Coast and up north in Taipei and down in Kanding have typically howling winds, and so it's a little bit unpleasant. There's a little window from Tainan to Kaohsiung down to Xiaoliuqiu that has a windbreak, and it's quite pleasant down there in the winter. But the summertime for the vast part of Taiwan is the best time to go.
But experienced sailors such as yourself, you'll still go out during the winter months around Taiwan, correct? Even though the howling winds and other challenges, or do you take a winter break?
Yeah, we take winter breaks too. I mean, because the wind, a couple seasons back, we had a late typhoon in Kanding, and we measured the wind at 55 knots, and then 1 week later we had a seasonal northeasterly, and it was blowing 58 knots. So very few people for pleasure would want to go out in a typhoon. and the northeasterlies can be as strong and colder than typhoons.
About how far out were you from port when you encountered that?
In Hobihu, which is down in Kanding, it's at the mouth of the port. It blows hard from the onset.
Who comes for the charters? Are these just friends who want to do an outing? Is it family get-togethers? Is it a corporate event?
Well, so the boats that I've always taken are a little bit smaller. So corporate events really, it's not that comfortable. It's a smaller boat. Mostly foreigners and people or Taiwanese who are affiliated with foreigners. There's a lot of Taiwanese that are taking these catamaran charters that go out to the Milky Bay out in Turtle Head Island or Turtle Back Island or off of Elon. And these people are in it for the Instagram pictures because there's not a whole lot of sailing. But it seems to me, as of now, mostly just the foreigners are interested in it.
And why is that? Why aren't more Taiwanese people interested in sailing?
I would say that Taiwanese girls don't like the sun, don't like the outside, and they don't like to get seasick, and most of them do on a boat.
What do you do as the captain before setting out to help mitigate the possibilities? What do you tell the passengers?
I tell them I make sure they have their Dramamine, and I make sure that they don't stay in the cabin. There's a couple little tricks. If you have to go in the cabin to get something, you have to hold your breath, and if you can't complete the job that you're supposed to do within one breath, you got to stick your head out, take a few breaths of fresh air, and then go back down.
Does that work? Does it work for everyone?
No, but it can mitigate the problems, because as soon as you get seasick, it's going to stick with you all day. And
what's a typical length of a charter trip?
Oh, it depends on anybody. I've gone out with people that were super exuberant. As soon as you left the port and you hit some swell, and everyone's laughing and giggling, and then 20 minutes later, everyone's sick, and they say, we want to go back.
I hope they still paid for the full day.
Yeah, they have to pay. But, I mean, there's lots of trips that, would be from, Tainan to the southern islands, Penghu, out in Chimay or Dongyuping and places like that. It's fantastic, and it's like a 3-day trip.
So
in the summer, it's usually flat. You can almost guarantee that it's flat, and so it's usually nice. Most people don't regret it, but there are always a few people on the trip that do get sick.
Are overnight trips popular?
Yeah, well, they have been. I mean, you have to take an overnight trip. It's like one day you sail out to one island, and then you stay in the port, and oftentimes there's like a little minsu or something, a bed and breakfast on the island. They'll stay there. We'll go to another island, and then during the day, just do day trips around and snorkel or swim or sunbathe or whatever. And then on the third day, go back. That would have been to Tainan. But Kanding works the same. You can do the same going to Orchid Island.
Do you have a favorite sort of itinerary that you recommend, especially for people who haven't done this before?
Yeah, I would say Tainan to Dongyuping, and then Dongyuping to Chimay, and then Chimay back to Tainan.
Well, how late in the day do you usually stay out if it's an overnight trip? I mean, is there opportunities for night photography, for example? So you go back after it's dark, or do you have to be in port prior to dusk?
It's always better to try to enter port in the daylight, but if you don't, you get a late start. I've gone into Tainan at midnight many times. Makes it kind of hard for the people, especially if they've got to go back to Taichung or Taipei or something like that. But, you don't get to always pick your times because it's a sailboat and it doesn't go very fast. And then if the wind dies or if it's not favorable, then your trip can, it could be from a 40-mile trip to a 60-mile trip.
Well, I get the feeling this is something you've had to explain to a few ornery passengers who are asking you why can't we be back in port yet?
You know what? I've experienced more Taiwanese boat owners who said that the first time they took their wives out, that's what their wives said, or their children. It's like, oh my God, this is taking so long. At
the risk of
thought 10 hours on a boat.
At the risk of asking the obvious question, Captain Chris, what about mobile phone service when you're out on the water?
If you've got Zhonghua, it's not too bad. You can, like if you were going to Penghu, you might expect to have about 4 or 5 hours where you didn't have it, but the rest of the time you would. So, not too bad. The other carriers, like on the small islands in Tonga, there's no service at all. Maybe only Yunchuan and Zhonghua has service, but the other one, phones are important. They keep the boredom away.
Well, yeah. When you mentioned that sometimes children are on the trips, I started to wonder about their ability to play with their phones while sailing.
You know what? All the kids that I've ever had on the boat were not the phone kind of kids. They were all running around and having fun, either that or not having fun and just sleeping.
Are there any legendary sea creatures that you've sometimes encountered while you're sailing around Taiwan?
Yeah, they've got these monsters out there. They're called kopang. They're the bamboo rafts that they weave together to catch oysters down south. And then they break loose at their mooring and they float around almost just below the surface, and you can hit them.
What about some of those Japanese movie sea creatures? Have they ever migrated south from Japan?
Outside Japan, I once saw something right on the surface that was kind of gray and had a tigery sort of a thing, and it looked big. And then once I saw the moon light up something that was as big as the boat encircling it. But
were you ever able to figure out what exactly it was?
Nope.
Were there
the mysteries of the deep.
Were there other witnesses to this?
No, most everyone's always sleeping. I'm the one who's awake all the time.
What about, you mentioned the bamboo sort of debris that sometimes comes up in the way. What about other boats or even larger ships? Are there ever any risks? I mean, do they see you, or is it unexpected? Container ships, for example. Is there? I assume there's plenty of room out there, but there's also the potential for getting too close. You ever have any experiences like that?
Almost every time. It's you wouldn't believe it, but as big as the ocean is, that you'd have so many times where you're on a collision course with something.
And is that just inevitable wherever people are sailing, or is that because there's not as many sailboats around Taiwan, so the larger ships are just they didn't expect to see you?
Oh, I think the larger ships, they've got their radar systems are pretty advanced, and so they know exactly what's happening. They'll usually from 5 miles out adjust their course just so they don't cause any concern, because they're pretty much they're not aware of the capabilities of the crew on the sailboat. You could have a complete bunch of rank amateurs out there, so they assume that it's their duty to miss you. And so usually that happens. But even if they wanted to hit you, they couldn't, because they're big and they can't maneuver. So even if you were coming right up on them, you can easily avoid them. You just have to make sure that someone's awake on the boat.
After we take a break, we'll talk a little bit more about government support for the industry. But what about when you're on the waters and you encounter, say, the Taiwan Coast Guard or the Taiwan Navy? Are they surprised to see sailboats around Taiwan and Taiwan-based sailboats?
I think, probably from about 6 years ago, they started to get used to it. I came in from Japan once and was entering Hualien port, and they must have been watching me on radar, because they had 2 cruisers out following us, and with bullhorns and trying to hail us on the radio, and they wanted to escort us in, and they had no idea what we were doing. And from longer ago than that, a couple of times going down the west coast, all of a sudden in the middle of the night, this cruiser with his lights off would come right up within 100 meters and then put his bright lights right on you and shadow you for half an hour. So, but that doesn't seem to happen anymore. So maybe what you say is right. Maybe the Taiwan Coast Guard is getting more accustomed to having sailboats.
But did they ever stop you on the water and board you?
I've never been boarded, but I've been followed into port and then boarded.
All right, well, we'll talk a little bit more about some of the interactions with the government, some of your other experiences with sailing after we take a short break. Our guest today is Captain Chris Carney, a Taiwan-based sailboat captain. You're listening to Residence Messenger on Taipei Broadcasting Station.
如有长照服务需求、长照特别扣除额问题，请拨打1966长照专线，5分钟内通话免付费。一通电话让长期照顾管理专员协助申请长期照顾服务及解答长期照顾特别扣除额相关问题。以上内容由台北市政府卫生局提供。
不开车，黄色嘟嘟安全多，应酬喝酒不过量，安全回家最上道。爸爸要平安回家哦。
喝酒不开车，开车不喝酒哦。让我们一起尊重生命，拥抱亲情。
亲爱的民众，提醒您定期清除排油烟机内部油垢。烹煮食物时，切忌分心做其他事情，并注意人离火熄。且厨房附近应设置灭火器，操作时保持适当距离。当厨房火灾时，严禁以水灭火。油锅起火也千万不要移动油锅，以免翻覆造成火势扩大延烧。以上内容由台北市政府消防局提供。
亲爱的朋友，您还在吸烟吗？快拿着健保卡到戒烟门诊或拨打戒烟专线0800636363。提醒您，最近兴起的电子烟、加热烟，因为没有浓浓的烟臭味，就被认为无害。其实已经证实，新兴烟品都有二手烟及三手烟的危害，甚至还有爆炸的风险。我是义工蔡依林，所有烟品都 get out。我拒烟，我骄傲。
教育部提醒大家，开学防疫不松懈，请家长每日量孩子体温，如有发烧请就医，并在家休息。上课时要全程佩戴口罩，采固定座位、固定成员。使用空调时保持通风良好。用餐时采个人套餐，使用隔板或维持社交距离，不并桌、不交谈。校园防疫不松懈，安心学习有保障。以上广告由教育部提供。
大家好，我是奥运举重国手郭幸存。举重不是硬碰硬，而是找对方法去面对它，就跟防疫一样。面对疫情，我们可以扎稳基本功，勤洗手、戴口罩，维持社交距离。 面对未知，我们可以谨慎以对，主动查证讯息，避免恐慌。让我们团结抗疫，一起为台湾拿下防疫金牌。台湾加油！
有政府，请安心。以上广告由行政院与机关署提供。
家己电台吼，家己主持咧。大家好，我是郭文哲，我伫台北广播电台。
谁当家？
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 你当家？
谁当家？
谁当家？
谁当家？我当家。你当家？我当家。到底谁当家？你来当家。
Welcome back to Residence Messenger on Taipei Broadcasting Station. I'm your host, Ross Darrell Feingold, and our guest today is Captain Chris Carney, Taiwan-based sailboat captain. Before the break, Chris, you were talking about being boarded in the past. What were the authorities looking for when they boarded your boats?
I don't know. Probably drugs. We were coming back from Chime in Penghu, and the guys that were on the crew, they threw my cell phone in the water by accident, and that was my GPS. So we had no navigation, and we left late, and we came in at night, and I mistook this place in Tainan for a place that was further south, and so we came so close into the coast before I realized where I was that we went off their land-based radar. So that raised red flags that we may have been making some sort of drop or meeting another boat or something like that. So
did they actually come on board and search the boat?
They did. There were 3 cruisers out that initially had us cornered, and they all came up with their lights off, and then their lights came on really bright. And I was talking to them on the radar saying, hey, I do this thing all the time, and I explained to them what happened. One cruiser followed me all the way into port, and then the Coast Guard did a pretty thorough search once I got into port.
Well, it's a good reminder to your passengers, don't bring any contraband on board.
Yeah.
But let's talk a little bit about government support. My understanding is historically the government was not so supportive of this activity because of security concerns. But as you mentioned, it's been changing a little bit, or for the better, over the years. But at the present time, what are still some of the challenges that sailboat captains or boat owners encounter with either local or the central government agencies?
Well, if you're the Taiwanese, I think they're trying to be more strict on the Taiwanese because they'll often try to skirt all these regulations by keeping their boat registered overseas. And mostly what that's for, not just for the trouble, but also to avoid paying the luxury tax on importing maybe a 5 million or 10 million or 20 million NT boat. So they don't have to pay the tax on that. And then if you got a foreign registered boat, there's lots of ports that you can't go to in Taiwan. They just won't let you in. Like Xiaoliuqiu is one. If your boat's not registered in Taiwan, they won't let you in, period. So that's a bit of a hurdle. If you just had a regular sized boat, even a second-hand boat that only cost $1 million NT, you'd be looking at paying 120 to 130 to 150,000 NT just to register it in Taiwan. So it's more than a tenth the cost of the boat just to get it registered, and that's just a one-time thing. So that's another issue. Yeah, it's not as liberal as it probably ought to be, but in most places the Coast Guard, they just kind of, once they get used to it, they just kind of let you do your thing. But there are a few issues. I mean, we're still living with the hangover of martial law and having restrictive policies against boating.
What are some of those, other than the high costs that you mentioned, what are some of the policies or regulations you'd like to see changed?
So there's the state of Delaware allows you to register boats, and they can do it sight unseen. The U.S. Coast Guard needs to inspect the yacht before they register it, and now the Taiwan government only allows U.S. boats that are registered with the Coast Guard to legally stay for any duration in Taiwan. So I wish that would change, because an American can buy a boat in Japan or in the Philippines or in Taiwan and want to register it in America, but the government won't really allow you to stay in a port for more than 3 months or 6 months, and then they'll ask you that you have to leave the country. But it doesn't make any sense. Where are you going to leave? Where are you going to go in COVID?
Speaking of COVID, how did that change? Especially, you mentioned that the summer is the ideal time. The summer months here in Taiwan are the ideal time to be on the boat, and that came right around the time of the increase in COVID cases around May and June of this year. How did that affect the past summer season or the period of months up to now?
All the outer islands have kind of gone berserk under their COVID policy. And so you have to jump through tons of hoops just to register, just to enter a port. And when they all used to be open, you could just sail in, and the guys would say, how long you stay in, just stay here, don't get in the way of the fishermen, and everything's going to be fine. But now you got to pre-register, and there are these issues that, well, your registration doesn't really seem to fit in, and you're not allowed to come here anymore. But even Taiwanese guys complain about stuff like that. If you go along the coast and you just enter a port and say, hey, we're tired, we just want to stop, and they say, you can't stop here, this is a fishing port. And they say, yeah, but we're tired. And they don't have, there's no recourse. The only thing you can do is pull out something broken from the engine and say, this is broken, we need to fix it. And then they can't legally force you out, but they all know that's a lie.
And this is simply because of COVID concerns? They don't want to let people come into port because you might be spreading COVID?
No, I don't think so. I think it's always been that way, that the fishing ports were dedicated to fishing ports, and they wouldn't let any private vessels, especially foreign registered vessels, in. But the COVID restrictions have made it even worse. So if there were anything that I would say that the government could do to improve the situation would be to lift these things, because just as long as we stay out of the way of the fishing boats, I think they should grant us access. In Japan now, you pretty much have access to all fishing ports, and they don't charge you. That would certainly welcome a lot more foreign sailors, although I'm not sure how much that's going to happen during COVID. Obviously, not very much. I knew some Russian guys that came in with engine problems, legitimate engine problems, and they were forced to stay on their tiny little boat with 3 people for 6 weeks. Couldn't leave the boat. So we were helping them out with groceries and stuff, but they ended up sailing for Korea or Vladivostok, and no one ever heard from them again, so we were not even sure if they made it.
What about things like mask rules? I remember last summer there were some news reports, a bunch of friends were on a small boat just for a leisure trip, doing some fishing off the Taiwan coast. But once they got out onto the water, started to fish, maybe started to have a few drinks, they took off their masks, and then some other boat came by, and the people actually called it in to the Coast Guard that they spotted people on a pleasure craft not wearing their masks.
That sounds highly suspicious to me, because most people don't really care. Everybody knows that most of these mask restrictions are more on the bogus side than anything else, and I always kind of had a no mask policy. Like if you were determined to wear your mask, maybe you had to go sit in a corner. Or say, all I know is that when two boats pass each other, you're supposed to smile and wave. And if you're so far opposite of that you're going to call the cops or report people for not wearing masks out in a boat under the sun in the ocean, right? I don't have much time for those kind of folks.
It violates the protocols and the etiquette of sailing.
It certainly does. Well, I mean, the Taiwanese fishermen, they're out there, and I don't think they can understand why people would go out on a boat for fun, because they have to. I mean, it's drudgery for them. You know, they go out in the morning and come back late at night, or they go out at night and come back in the morning. But if you got girls in bikinis on the boat, they're all smiles and waves then. So they're coming around.
Speaking of coming around, are there any local governments, because you've mentioned all the different ports that you sometimes have to go into, are there any local governments in Taiwan, any of the cities or counties where they truly are supportive of growing the sailing scene in Taiwan?
I would say Tainan is probably the most liberal. It used to be a place called Xindagang, and that's a part of Kaohsiung, but they had a real hard ass that started with the Coast Guard there, and that changed. So Tainan, I think, probably is the best. Hobihu seems to be the most liberal because that one is controlled by the Kunding National Park, and it's not a part of the Fisheries Association. So that one seems to be the most helpful. I mean, if I was going to have a boat anywhere in Taiwan, I would have it in Hobihu, personally. But it's not very convenient because most of the guys that have enough money to buy a boat don't live in Hengchun, right? They live up north somewhere.
Yeah, and you had mentioned most of the charters that you do are in southern Taiwan. You're based in southern Taiwan. Why is southern Taiwan more ideal than northern Taiwan for sailing?
It's the weather. It's just drier. So in the winter, it's always breezy and it's sunny and quite a bit warmer. Up north, it'll be breezy, but there's so much current, and when current fights waves, it makes really sloppy ocean. So all those ports, like outside of Geelong, and as soon as you go out, if the wind's not right, it's just sloppy, and it's often rainy and cold. The water's cleaner. It's nice. The whole West Coast, the water, you have to go out 10 miles before the water gets clean. And on the East Coast, you just go out just a little bit, and the water's great, but it's often not pleasant. So the South is much, much, much better for sailing because you can do it all year round, and everybody likes the sun, right? If you're on a boat, you want to be in the sun a little bit.
What about for the logistical side, things like spare parts or repairs? You mentioned sometimes you need to urgently go into port to make a repair. What are some of the good locations in Taiwan for those kinds of services?
I would say there are very few. There's a couple outfits in Geelong that could locate a part pretty quickly, and Kaohsiung has got a lot of guys that can do it. But they're all dealing with international people, and so they might have stock of parts that might go bad, but mostly you're kind of on your own. You're always shopping, and you're always trying to bring stuff in from overseas. Hong Kong actually is a big conduit for sailboat parts that come into Taiwan, just because the market there is so much bigger and they have got a large supply. So Taiwan is a absolute fledgling market for stuff like this. There's just not enough boats to warrant people having a warehouse of parts.
Do you expect more foreign visitors or people to sail into Taiwan after COVID, or are people going to be eagerly going to some of the more famous locations around the region once normal travel resumes?
Well, I don't know. I assume that as soon as it opens back up, there'll be the standard amount of traffic coming back in here. There seems to be a lot more Australians that would sail into Taiwan than from anywhere else. That and Americans, maybe Canadians, but it certainly isn't a lot. If you were in some bay in the Philippines, there might be 50 boats on a mooring, all from different countries, and some of them are liveaboards, and some people have parked their boat there and taken 6 months to make money back in their home country or live in Manila or something. There really isn't that community here yet.
And to build that community, for people who want to experience sailing, what's a good way to try it out or to contact you for a charter?
You talking about a plug?
Sure, go for it.
Well, I have a site called Amping Sailing. It's on Facebook, and if you send me a message, I can set you up with a whole range of possibilities. Mostly, it's all based in Kunding right now. So, if you plan on being in Kunding and looking for something to do that's kind of a unique experience, then I would highly recommend it. If I were in Tainan, then in the summertime there would trips going to Penghu all the time, and Penghu is fantastic. It's the coral out there, if there's not jellyfish, is really worth seeing. You jump in there with your snorkel, and there's several spots that are almost untouched. Really nice. Although with COVID, Taiwanese haven't been able to travel overseas, and so all these places are getting lots of traffic. So in that way, COVID is kind of a blessing for the local market, because all those folks that would have normally gone to some place like the Philippines or Thailand or Malaysia or wherever can't. So they got to use their imagination and go somewhere here.
Well, on that note, Chris, we want to thank you for joining us today and sharing your experience with sailing in Taiwan, and hopefully more people will have the chance to experience sailing with you.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity.
You've been listening to Residence Messenger on Taipei Broadcasting Station with our special guest, Captain Chris Carney, a sailboat captain here in Taiwan. Thank you for watching and listening, and have a great weekend.